This is MrsAgroSquerril standing in for Agro while he recovers from some vocal strain. He is recovering, but it could still be a while. I hope you enjoy. Alien vs. Romance Novel by Lane Meller. Gar turned to the woman again. She was so tiny in comparison to his bulk. Although he knew he was large for a Globan man, the shadow he cast, completely dwarfed her being, made him pause. It stirred something primitive inside of him, as he cut her loose from the rotting wood she had been hastily strapped to by the slavers, lingering over several long bruises and scrapes. He absently tucked the long strands of her golden hair behind the shell of her ear, so unlike his own pointed ear, so rounded and smooth, so exotic. He wanted to protect her. Excerpt from The Alien's Princess. The distant cry of birds and beasts echoed in the background, in the usual cacophony of noise, as each being greeted the approaching sunlight. Jacoby was facing forward towards the sea of foliage, by all accounts paying attention to his surroundings. Guard duty was usually dull, and even most excitement was caused from that same boredom these days. But it was easy enough to set up a simple program to scroll text while you stood still, and so novels were traded with increasing frequency, like the one he was browsing now. Videos had unfortunately been banned after a particularly hilarious incident, when one of the cadets had distracted all of the guards with a compilation of the leader running into a door over and over again to sneak in and steal an entire pan of candy. The leader had been furious, but much worse was the cook on duty, an older gentleman who was used to ruling the kitchens like his own personal kingdom. So videos had been banned, but worse had been the lack of dessert for weeks because of the chef. That man was good at holding a grudge. So now he was working his way down the list of books up for trade to escape absolute boredom. The orange trees and purple sky were gorgeous the first 1,000 times, but staring at the same image day in and day out, no matter how lovely, got old fast. But this particular book, this one was not what he was expecting at all. Humans were a relatively new addition to the galactic political world, but they'd already ruffled more than a few feathers. This had apparently been penned by one of them. Jacoby himself was not overly fond of what he'd seen so far, and they were considered political enemies of his people, always yelling and angry for such a small species. With no control, they seemed to overspill with passion. He had not considered what that might mean in other contexts, or that they might also hold similar values and wishes. He shifted from one foot to the other. But this book, this romance novel, as the opening page had called it, gave a rather tantalizing view of those traits. Many things his own culture held dear seemed emulated within the human woman being described, all wrapped in an adorable, vibrant package. Perhaps he should volunteer for the next rotation to that particular border, Jacoby mused. Maybe even a vacation to the Milky Way, if that wasn't possible. He could meet one of these humans and see for himself if rounded ears were really as cute as they had been written. Gar watched in trepidation as the human woman took her first steps away from the high bed. She was still so pale and weak. He had seen the fear in her eyes when he'd scooped her up days ago, unable to walk, and brought her here. But now she gave him a small smile, eyes still downcast as she surveyed the parts of the room she couldn't quite view before. He wanted to pull her into his arms again, but it was too soon. Excerpt from The Alien's Princess. Teller was grubby. She'd been strapped to the underside of the same spaceship, rubbing in paint stripper and then scraping off the goopy remains. No matter how careful she worked, it still always seemed to get in her hair, so she'd cut it short ages ago. At least now it was easier to clean after shift. It was shit work, and dirty as hell, but it paid a decent wage, and no one was shooting at her. So it was still better than half the gigs she'd taken in the past. The twinge in one knee reminded her of why she avoided mercenary work these days as she pushed herself to the next portion of desiccated metal and paint. She rolled one stiff shoulder and then another, going back to the damp goo she'd spread on moments before, not even flinching when it spattered against the belly. She was already well on her way to looking like a modern art already. What was one more splash? It was satisfying, at least, to watch each stripe of old paint come off. like those videos of kinetic sand that ASMR channels liked so much. Just smellier and closer, she supposed. Finally, the whistle that signified the first break rang out through the hodgepodge of the repair shop, easily cutting through the din of different languages being bandied about and the clang of tools on metal that was the staple of every worker there. She released the gravlocks that were holding the lines to the bottom of the ship and then slowly floated down to the ground below. The first time she'd seen someone with anti-grav boots do such a move, Teller had screeched, but now she was an old pro herself, gliding down as easily as any of the other employees. As soon as toes touched the earth, she was turning off her suit and stripping out of it, snagging her goggles into one sleeve with a jolt as she pushed herself to escape. She was starving, and the sooner she escaped the bulky PPE that she wore for work and shoved it in the laundry chute, the sooner she could shovel leftovers into her maw. And if she was lucky, she could also snag a good place in line for the microwave. Stupid owners were skimpy. Everyone has the same lunchtime, but there's only 2 heating apparatuses for 50 beings. To be fair, some of the employees were of species that didn't cook their food, but Teller refused to eat a cold lunch every day if she didn't have to ever again. She was just shoving her gear away and grabbing her lunch from her locker when she felt eyes on the back of her neck. The small hair stood straight up, and she had to quell the urge to whip around to see who was staring so intently. She glanced back, trying for subtlety, although it wasn't her strongest suit. It was the Globine they had hired a few weeks ago. The golden eyes that were common among the species fixed onto her. He stood head and shoulders above the rest of the beings that made up the repair crews, so it was hard to miss. Teller felt her shoulders hunch up as she endeavored to make herself smaller. She didn't know his name. Hell, she didn't think they'd actually exchanged a single word between the two of them. And he had not seemed particularly prejudiced against humans before, although the two species were not known for getting along particularly well. Most humans considered them snobby and robotic, and in return they called humans flighty and uncontrolled. So yeah, not usually the best of friends. Now he was laser-focused on her. His overwhelming height and the scar that went from his hairline to chin, only to disappear into the collar of his high-necked shirt, and then reappeared from the cuff of his sleeve all the way down to remarkably human-looking hands, also made her leery. It gave him a devilish quality she found disconcerting. Not just anyone could survive a wound like that. She squirmed a bit under the intense scrutiny, but didn't let that extend to her facial features. She wouldn't give him the benefit of seeing how uncomfortable she was. Fuck that guy. If he kept this up, she'd show him exactly why they'd called her Talon when she had worked as a bounty hunter. Xena huddled under the warm blankets the alien man had gifted her. He was frightening and yet so kind and so attractive. She had taken to stealing glances when he wasn't looking. She admired the breadth of his shoulders and the curve of one massive bicep. Excerpt from The Alien's Princess. Rawl was a Globine on a mission. He checked once again to see that his long hair was properly tied back and that all of the medals on his uniform gleamed. It had been weeks, and he was still grounded on guard duty on an obsolete trading platform. It had been absolute hell for the most part. The only upside had been the human woman. Just like the one in the book, his own alien princess. She even had the same tiny ears and golden hair, although sadly it was much shorter than what had been described in the novel. But she wore it twisted up, exposing the delicate sweep of her neck, which he liked. It was fascinating to watch her, a tiny ball containing a whirlwind of emotions. He was not the only one. The dratted book had been making the rounds, it seemed. Rawl was at least being discreet, taking wide-angle video shots of the area when she was working nearby with his helmet camera. These amateurs were openly staring at her. They were in full armor. The fools could at least pretend to look elsewhere. In fact, most of the off-duty warriors were about in the cafe, and they all seemed awfully attentive when she came by to serve them tea. Far too attentive. Golden eyes narrowed behind his visor as he watched the small group of off-duty guards, all perched on the daintily carved yet oddly mismatched chairs that dotted the eatery. Humans don't court the same way a globine does, you silly man. The old human woman peered down on him with amusement even as she blessed him with her wisdom. Your fighting and posturing will only drive her further away. Then tell me, elder mother, how may I woo her? He asked reverently, leaning forward eagerly. What can I do to show her that all of my heart belongs only to her? Well, traditional gifts would be something sweet, flowers or jewelry. Poetry, especially if it's written just for her, is also well liked. Then, if that's well received, you move on to dinner dates and long walks on the beach. The crone gently explained to the tall globine. You must be patient, but persistent. Excerpt from The Alien's Princess. Jessica was dying. A sneeze welled up as the soft petal of a garish orange flower as tall as her brushed against her face as she picked leaves out of her hair. This was the 8th time today that a globine had shoved a full-sized plant at her before running away again. No warning, no explanation. Just leaves and branches to the face. And as Jessica's immune system reacted poorly to pollen, this was torture of the most insidious kind. She was definitely stocking the office with allergy pills in the future, and possibly a metal bat as well. The reception desk was now flanked on both sides by foliage that she didn't want to approach. Where was she going to stash her latest acquisition? She heard the sound of the door sliding open once more, although it was blocked by the orange and pink monstrosity that was leaning against her desk. She held a wad of tissues to her watering eyes, peering around the magenta branches owlishly to see who had arrived. Green eyes met gold ones as she surveyed the massive alien who was pushing her way through. Another globine. This one with short, spiky dark hair pushed rakishly to one side. Jessica reeled back, not mentally prepared for yet another assault on her sinuses. I am Glor. This is for you, the female globine said happily, then dropped something on top of the plexiglass of the fancy desktop. Jessica blinked, then blinked again. Red, puffy eyes gazed below at the package that had been unceremoniously dropped before her. It was a bag of brown sugar. For baking. She looked up at the alien to demand answers, but the sound of the door sliding closed once more stopped her. Leaving weird things and then fleeing was the pattern, apparently. She was glad it wasn't a plant this time. But what the hell was she supposed to do with 20 pounds of sugar? Jessica growled and made her way to lock up. She more than deserved to close 5 minutes early. She left behind the odd assortment of gifts and grabbed her purse and jacket. That was a problem for the morning. She escaped the allergen-filled space. Each breath easier than the last until she made it to the scooter she used to commute to and from home. A small piece of actual paper was clipped to it. No one used paper anymore for something so mundane. She pulled it from where it had been wedged, and with shaking fingers opened it. This was like one of those horror movies Jessica had watched as a child. There would be strange cutouts from old newspapers demanding a ransom or threatening to kill her. Instead, it was simple ink on paper, with incredibly fancy font like the one she'd seen for her cousin's overpriced wedding. You shine like the logic of a quadratic equation. You glow like a sun among the moons. You sparkle like two blades clashing as warriors fight. You radiate like the dangerous power of fusion. You emit radiation that could pierce any heart. What? Jessica felt even more confused now. End of story.
I'd greatly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Caspar Arnholtz, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.